Welcome back. We will continue with the part 2 of a class on the anatomy of cerebrum. The specific learning objectives of today's class are 1. Functional areas, 2. Cerebral dominance, and 3. Blood supply. The cerebral cortex is the surface layer of grey matter covering the cerebral hemisphere. The cortex represents the highest degree of evolutionary development of the human brain, both in its relative size to other parts of the brain and its range of functions. It is principally responsible for 3 basic brain functions. So it performs basically 3 brain functions, namely perception, adaptation responses, and movement, which are common in all animals. In addition, it is a site for various types of mental activities like memory, learning, speech and language abilities, intelligence, and creative thinking. In general, each cerebral hemisphere controls the opposite half of the body. That is, it sends motor commands to and receives sensory information from the contralateral half of the body. Now we'll see the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex can be demarcated into a large number of areas which differ from each other in structure as well as in function. And these areas of the cerebral cortex can be assigned specific functions. And these areas usually can be defined in terms of the various sulci and the gyri that we have seen before. These functional areas were first described by Brodmann, and he had divided the cerebral cortex into 47 areas and indicated each of them by a number which is called as the Brodmann's number. His classification was mainly based on the cytoarchitecture of the cerebral cortex. According to the classic teaching, the cerebral cortex possesses 3 types of functional areas. 1. Motor areas. These areas are primarily concerned with the motor functions. 2. Sensory areas. These areas are primarily concerned with the sensory functions. 3. Association areas. These areas are not concerned with primary motor or sensory functions but have more important associative, integrative, and cognitive functions. The association areas occupy more than 75% of the total surface area of the cerebral cortex in man. The major motor areas present in the cerebral cortex are primary motor area, premotor area, supplementary motor area, and frontal eye field. Now we'll try to see the details of a few of them. The most important among these areas is the primary motor area, designated as area 4 of Brodmann. The primary motor area is located in the precentral gyrus on the superolateral surface and extends to the anterior part of paracentral lobule on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It contains a large number of pyramidal cells, including the large pyramidal cells or the Betz cells. About 40% of the pyramidal, which includes the corticospinal and the corticonuclear fibers, arise from this area. The primary motor area controls the voluntary motor activities of the opposite half of the body. Now what you see here, the human body is represented in an upside down manner in the precentral gyrus, which is called as the motor homunculus. Motor homunculus, as shown in the picture. As you can see here, the pharyngeal region and the tongue are represented in the lowermost part, followed by face, hand, trunk and thigh. The legs, feet and perineum are represented on the medial surface of the hemisphere in the paracentral lobule. Further, there is a disproportionate registration of the individual parts here. The area of cortex controlling a particular movement is proportional to the skill involved in performing that movement and not related to the bulk of the muscle participating in the movement. Thus, the face, especially the lips, tongue, larynx and hand have disproportionately large representation in this motor homunculus, while the trunk and the lower limb have smaller areas. The second important motor area is the premotor area or area 6 of Brodmann. The premotor area is located anterior to the primary motor area in the posterior part of the superior, middle and inferior frontal gyri and extends on to the medial surface of the hemisphere. It is the main site for the cortical origin of extrapyramidal fibers, which includes the corticorubral, cortico-olivary, corticonigral, etc. The premotor area is responsible for the successful performance of the voluntary motor activities. The frontal eye field is located in the posterior part of the middle frontal gyrus. The frontal eye field controls voluntary scanning movements of the eyes and is independent of the visual stimuli. The part of the frontal lobe anterior to the motor and premotor areas is referred to as the prefrontal area or the prefrontal cortex. This area is predominantly concerned with the personality of the individual. The prefrontal area plays important role in memory formation, emotions, decision making, judgment, reasoning, personality and social behavior of the individual. Can you take a few seconds off and try to identify this epic English film which vividly portrays the important functions of the prefrontal cortex in humans. Now we'll see one very important motor area called as the motor speech area. It is also called as the Broca's area, designated by Brodmann's numbers 44 and 45. The Broca's area is located in the pars triangularis and pars opercularis of the inferior frontal gyrus in the dominant hemisphere. The Broca's area is responsible for the production of expressive speech or vocalization. Any lesion of the Broca's area will produce inability to produce speech, which is called as motor aphasia. This animation will help you to visualize some of the major functional areas that we have studied so far. Now coming to the sensory areas. The important sensory areas are the somesthetic area, visual area, auditory area, vestibular area, gustatory area, and the olfactory area. The most important of these is the primary sensory area, also termed as the primary somatosensory area, designated by numbers 3, 1 and 2 of Brodmann. The primary sensory area is located in the post-central gyrus and extends into the posterior part of the paracentral lobule on the medial surface of the hemisphere. The opposite half of the body is represented upside down, exactly in the same fashion as we have seen in the primary motor area. The primary sensory area is concerned with the perception of exteroceptive and proprioceptive sensations from opposite half of the body. This is how the opposite half of the body is represented upside down in the primary sensory area. So this representation is termed as the sensory homunculus. Now coming to the sensory association areas. These areas occupy the superior parietal lobule corresponding to the areas 5 and 7 of Brodmann. This area is primarily concerned with the perception of shape, size, roughness and texture of an object. Any lesions of the sensory association area result in an inability to recognize or identify an object by its feel. This condition is called as astereognosis. You have already seen the motor speech area. Now there is one more speech area which is called as the sensory speech area or the Wernicke's area. It is located in the left dominant hemisphere, occupying the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus and the angular and supramarginal gyri of the inferior parietal lobule. They are designated as Brodmann's numbers 39 and 40. The Wernicke's area is concerned with the interpretation of language through visual and auditory input. The sensory and motor speech areas exist together in one hemisphere, that's the dominant hemisphere. The Wernicke's area is connected to the Broca's area by a bundle of nerve fibers called as arcuate fasciculus. Lesions of Wernicke's area in the dominant hemisphere produce loss of ability to understand the spoken and written speech. This condition is called as receptive or sensory aphasia. What will happen in a lesion involving both Broca's and Wernicke's speech area? in the dominant hemisphere. Such a lesion involving both these areas will result in loss of production of speech as well as loss of understanding of the spoken and written speech. This condition is called as global aphasia. The taste area is located in the inferior part of the parietal lobe, or in the lower end of the postcentral gyrus in the superior wall of the lateral sulcus, or in the adjoining area of the insula. It is designated by Brodmann's number 43. This animation will help you to identify some of the important sensory areas. Now coming to the important areas seen in the temporal lobe. First we will see about the primary auditory area, designated as Brodmann's numbers 41 and 42. The primary auditory area is located in the superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus, occupying the anterior transverse temporal gyrus or the Heschel's gyrus, and extends slightly to the adjacent part of the superior temporal gyrus. This area is primarily concerned with the reception of isolated impressions related to loudness, quality, pitch, and the source of sound. The olfactory area is also located in the temporal lobe, designated as Brodmann's area 28. It is located in the anterior part of the para-hippocampal gyrus and the uncus. This animation helps you to identify the important areas located in the temporal lobe of cerebral cortex. Take a close look at this brain and find out what is special about this. Please don't forget to share your answer with me. Now let us see the important sensory area seen in the occipital lobe. It is none other than the primary visual area, designated as Brodmann's area 17. The primary visual area is situated in the walls and floor of the posterior part of the calcarine sulcus. It may extend into the cuneus and lingual gyrus. It is also called as the striate cortex because of the presence of the visual stria of Genari. The macular area, which is a central area of retina and responsible for maximum visual acuity, has extensive cortical representation occupying approximately posterior 1/3 of the visual cortex. The primary visual cortex is concerned with the reception and perception of isolated visual impressions such as color, size, form, motion, illumination, and transparency. As you can see in this slide, the most marked structural feature of the visual cortex is the presence of the white stria, otherwise called as the visual stria of Genari, hence the name the striate cortex. This animation will help you to identify the visual area and the visual association areas in the occipital lobe. We have finished the discussion of the important functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Now, take this visual quiz for a quick recap. Now, try to identify the important cortical regions or the functional areas on the superlateral surface of cerebral hemisphere marked from A to K. You can check your answers in the next slide. Hope you have checked your answers. Please let me know your score. Now coming to the next learning objective. What do you mean by cerebral hemispheric dominance? In spite of an apparent congruity in size, shape and features of the left and right cerebral hemispheres, they are not mirror images as far as certain neuronal activities are concerned. There are certain established functional differences between the two hemispheres. That means some of the brain functions are lateralized. The left hemisphere is more effective as far as handedness, perception of language, speech, writing and calculation, that means numerical skills, are concerned. The right hemisphere is more efficient with spatial perception, that means geometrical and spatial relationships, recognition of faces, creative acts of arts and music, and non-verbal ideation. As you can see here, the left hemisphere is more efficient as far as language, speech, writing and calculation skills are concerned, whereas the right hemisphere is more active in 3D perception, singing and playing of musical instruments. The term dominant hemisphere refers to the side concerned with the perception and production of language and speech. Once again, the term dominant hemisphere refers to the side concerned with the perception and production of language and speech. According to this concept, the left hemisphere is dominant in more than 90% of people. And in these people, the right hemisphere is described as a minor or non-dominant hemisphere. During childhood, one hemisphere slowly comes to dominate over the other, and it is only after the first decade of life that the dominance becomes fixed. Now we will take a quick look at the arterial supply of the different surfaces of cerebral hemisphere. We will be studying the details in our class on the blood supply of brain. This picture shows the arterial supply of the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. As we will be studying later, the cerebrum is supplied by three major arteries: anterior, middle and posterior cerebral arteries. As you can see from this picture, most of the superolateral surface is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The region of the cerebral cortex supplied by the middle cerebral artery includes the greater parts of the primary motor and sensory areas and the frontal eye field. In the dominant, that usually means the left hemisphere, it includes the Broca's and Wernicke's speech areas. A narrow strip of cerebral cortex adjoining the supromedial border up to the parieto-occipital sulcus. It's supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. The upper parts of the primary motor and sensory areas lie in the region of supply of anterior cerebral artery. A narrow strip along the lower border of temporal lobe, excluding the temporal pole, and the occipital lobe are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. The posterior parts of the visual area fall in this area of supply of posterior cerebral artery. Now coming to the arterial supply of the medial surface. Most of the medial surface is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. The region of the cerebral cortex supplied by anterior cerebral artery includes the parts of the motor and sensory areas concerned with the perineum, leg and the foot located on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, otherwise called as the paracentral lobule. So, the paracentral lobule receives the arterial supply from anterior cerebral artery. The temporal pole of the temporal lobe is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The occipital lobe is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. The area supplied includes the visual cortex. Lastly, we will see the arterial supply of the inferior surface of cerebral hemisphere. The most of the inferior surface, except the temporal pole, is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. The lateral part of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe and the temporal pole of the temporal lobe are supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The medial part of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. To revise the blood supply, each of the surface of the cerebral hemisphere is supplied by all the three cerebral arteries, namely anterior, middle and posterior. Most of the superlateral surface is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, most of the medial surface by the anterior cerebral artery, and most of the inferior surface by the posterior cerebral artery. Now time for a little bit of homework. Go through the two classes on cerebrum and try to work out the answers for the following questions. Describe the external features of cerebral hemisphere. Identify the major sulci and gyri on the superlateral surface of cerebrum with the help of a simple, neat diagram. Identify the major sulci and the gyri on the medial surface of cerebrum with the help of a diagram. Describe the functional areas on the supralateral surface of the cerebrum with the help of a diagram. This is an important question from your examination point of view. Describe the term cerebral dominance. And finally, draw a neat shaded diagrams to show the arterial supply of the different surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Thank you and have a nice time with your cerebrum.